Even as peace returned to Rome, Augustus could not rest. The streets were orderly, the markets bustling, and the Senate continued its ceremonial debates. Yet the city felt like a fragile jewel in a precarious hand. The shadows of past civil wars lingered everywhere. He remembered the cries of citizens fleeing the forum during violent uprisings, the sound of swords clashing in the streets, and the betrayal of men he once trusted, friends who had become enemies in the blink of an ambition-fueled eye. Every law he enacted, every decree he sent across the provinces, a public was measured against the lessons of that chaos. He understood more than anyone that the survival of Rome depended not on fleeting acts of heroism, but on careful, deliberate orchestration. The Senate, aware of Augustus' authority, spoke with caution. Their words, once the lifeblood of Roman politics, now felt like echoes in a chamber that no longer controlled destiny. Augustus allowed them the theater of influence, granting speeches, minor legislative debates, and ceremonial quiddies, knowing full that the real levers of power rested firmly with him. Senators who attempted to overreach were not punished with open violence, as in the days of Caesar, but subtly corrected. They were humiliated, socially isolated, or assigned to distant posts. The illusion of freedom remained intact, but the reality was clear: power was centralized, and any misstep could mean the quiet end of a career. Augustus had learned that the most enduring control was often invisible. The consent of the governed could be cultivated without a single sword being drawn. In the provinces, Augustus implemented reforms that stabilized the empire's vast territories. Governors were carefully selected for loyalty, skill, and the ability to understand the delicate balance of power in their regions. They were rotated, monitored, and held accountable through a network of trustworthy officials. Rome's borders from Hispania to Egypt were patrolled not only to defend the empire, but to prevent any general from gaining the kind of influence that had toppled the republic. Legions were stationed strategically, disciplined in obedience to state rather than personal ambition, and rewarded with pensions, land, and honor. Every measure reinforced stability. Even abolition of taxes or the maintenance of aqueducts were structured to maintain efficiency while discouraging the accumulation of dangerous power. Augustus understood the subtle psychology of control. Loyalty could be engineered, and obedience could be made preferable to ambition. Yet Augustus knew that control alone would not secure lasting peace. Rome's citizens remembered the horrors of civil war, but memory could fade or be distorted. To cultivate loyalty, he intertwined governance with culture. Festivals, gladiatorial games, chariot races, not just entertainment but instruments of cohesion. Citizens gathered in the Circus Maximus, the Colosseum yet to built but envisioned, or the Forum, witnessing the same stories, hearing the same speeches, and participating in shared rituals. In these moments, social unity was reinforced. People learned to associate Augustus' rule with stability, prosperity, and collective pride. He was omnipresent in ways that were invisible, a guiding force that citizens felt rather than consciously acknowledged. Education, too, became a subtle instrument. Young Romans were taught the history of their city, with emphasis on the fragility of the past. Caesar's brilliance was recognized, but flamboyance undone by ambition. Brutus and Cassius were remembered as idealists blinded by pride. Rome itself was depicted as perpetually vulnerable, a civilization that could only survive under careful stewardship. Children internalized these lessons, growing up understanding that order was a gift and that Augustus had preserved it. In classrooms and tutor-led discussions, stories of war, betrayal, and triumph were woven with moral insus of Rome required both vigilance and obedience. Even the army, the backbone of imperial authority, was carefully engineered to prevent rebellion. Augustus restructured legions, creating permanent, professional forces loyal not to individual commanders but to Rome itself. Generals were rewarded for service but constrained by oversight and rotation. Soldiers understood that glory belonged to Rome, not themselves, and that personal ambition carried consequences. Veterans were settled with land and pensions, their loyalty reinforced with tangible rewards. Augustus' genius lay in aligning self-interest with state interest, ensuring that obedience became both rational and desirable. Augustus also refined religious influence to strengthen societal cohesion. He associated his rule with divine favor, commissioning temples and sponsoring priesthoods. While he did not immediately declare himself a god, he ensured that Rome's religious practices reflected and reinforced his authority. Citizens believed that the emperor's hand was guided by the gods, a subtle form of legitimacy that required no violence to enforce. Rituals, sacrifices, and ceremonies were staged carefully to emphasize continuity and order, embedding Augustus' presence into the spiritual and moral fabric of the empire. Even as Augustus expanded his influence, he never stopped observing. Every whisper in the forum, every subtle shift in provincial loyalty, every rumor in the streets was noted. Potensos what's utilized, quietly exile, reassignment, or political marginalization replaced open purges. Fear persisted, but it was invisible, embedded in routine and consequence. Citizens obeyed, not merely because they feared, but because the cost of disruption was clear and tangible. Augustus had mastered governance not through spectacle, but through strategy, perception, and psychology. Succession remained his greatest concern. Each potential heir was scrutinized for intelligence, temperament, loyalty, and public perception. Early deaths and unexpected losses underscored the fragility of human plans. Augustus tested family members, nephews, and grandchildren, gradually introducing them to governance, military defiance, and public duties. The survival of Rome required that this careful preparation succeed. A weak or reckless successor could undo decades of meticulous planning. In this awareness lay a subtle anxiety that even peace could not quell. The city of Rome itself, while stable, bore witness to subtle transformations. Citizens engaged in civic life, voted in minor elections, and attended assemblies, but the real levers of power were elsewhere. The public maintained the illusion of participation while the machinery of empire functioned with seamless efficiency. Augustus understood that true power is often invisible. It requires patience, subtlety, and the ability to shape perception. Obedience became habitual, loyalty natural, and peace an expectation rather than a fragile achievement. Even as Augustus solidified control in Rome, his attention turned outward to the provinces. The empire stretched from the deserts of Egypt to the forests of Germania, from the sun-baked plains of Hispania to the distant reaches of Asia Minor. Each territory had its own traditions, lenvances, and Augustus understood that maintaining unity required more than military presence. It required respect, subtle influence, and careful administration. Governors were monitored continuously, their actions reported back to the palace. Taxes were collected efficiently, but harsh imposition was avoided, as resentment could spread like wildfire. Augustus studied patterns of rebellion, trade, and local politics, creating a system that rewarded loyalty and punished defiance indirectly, without creating martyrs or provoking uprisings. To reinforce cultural cohesion, Augustus initiated building projects across the empire. Roads, bridges, aqueducts, and temples were commissioned to demonstrate both Roman engineering and the benefits of imperial oversight. Cities that had once resented Roman presence now prospered under stable infrastructure. Markets flourished, trade routes opened, and citizens felt the tangible benefits of centralized authority. In Gaul, farms expanded under Roman guidance. In Egypt, grain flowed steadily to the capital. In the millicent provinces of Hispania, military garrisons protected towns, while civic affairs. Augustus understood that prosperity was loyalty, and loyalty was security. Augustus also understood the power of narrative. He commissioned poets, historians, and artists to celebrate the triumph of order over chaos. Public monuments were adorned with inscriptions glorifying Rome's rebirth and the emperor's guidance. Every forum, every temple, every triumphal arch carried a subtle lesson. Rome endured because it was wisely governed. Children learning history were taught that let's was not inevitable, but prevented through careful stewardship. Citizens internalized this message, connecting the prosperity of the present directly to Augustus' vision. Memory itself became a tool of control, shaping generations' perceptions of authority, obedience, and civic duty. Within the city, Augustus further reinforced his influence. The festival ceremonies, gladiatorial games, chariot races, and theatrical performances were staged with careful attention to audience engagement. Spectators were not merely entertained, they were subtly reminded of the power, generosity, and omnipresence of the emperor. Victories in the arena mirrored victories in discipline, loyalty, and the rewards of obedience. Public feasts, religious ceremonies, and communal celebrations created shared sense of belonging. Augustus' influence was everywhere, yet it was largely invisible. Citizens saw joy, not control; peace, not orchestration. Education became a central pillar of Augustus' strategy. Tutors, philosophers, and rhetoricians were employed to teach the lexis innovation wallence about the dangers of disorder and the virtues of order. Caesar's brilliance was acknowledged, but framed as reckless. Brutus and Cassius were cautionary examples of pride and folly. Students were encouraged to see Augustus as the preserver, the stabilizer, the man who had rescued Rome from its own chaos. They learned that the empire's survival led of deliberate guidance, and that stability was both a moral and civic duty. In this way, obedience was internalized, not imposed. The army, ever the backbone of imperial power, remained a priority. Augustus reformed its structure, creating permanent legions loyal to Rome rather than individual generals. Military service became professionalized, with clear standards of training, discipline, and reward. Soldiers understood that their honor and success were tied to the state's stability, not personal ambition. Commanders who demonstrated loyalty and competence were rewarded, but unchecked ambition was carefully monitored and curtailed. Veterans were granted land, pensions, and social recognition, binding their personal welfare to the continued strength of the empire. In every maneuver, every deployment, Augustus reinforced the principle that power was shared with Rome, but ultimately centralized under his guidance. Even religious life was aligned with Augustus's vision. Temples were constructed, priesthoods appointed, and festivals sponsored to promote loyalty, reverence, and obedience. Augustus did not openly claim divinity during his lifetime, but the emperor's presence was always associated with divine favor. Rituals emphasized hierarchy, discipline, and civic virtue while subtly reinforcing Augustus' authority. In public consciousness, he became inseparable from the order and stability that defined the new Rome. Citizens were guided to believe that their well-being, their safety, and their prosperity were reflections of both the god's favor and Augustus' skillful stewardship. In his private chambers, Augustus reflected on the fragility of the city. Success depended not just on laws or armies, but on the perceptions, beliefs, and habits of citizens. He monitored reports, intercepted whispers of dissent, and adjusted policies before minor unrest could escalate. Exile, reassignment, or social marginalization were preferred tools over open punishment. Fear, while present, was nuanced and invisible. Citizens complied not merely because they feared consequences, because stability had become their natural expectation. Augustus' genius lay in creating a civilization voluntarily, guided by perception, memory, and subtle social pressures. Succession remained his greatest concern. Tiberius, his chosen heir, was trained carefully in governance, military strategy, and public presentation. Augustus introduced him gradually to the Woodsandy sunset, testing his judgment and patience. The young heir observed public ceremonies, conducted minor military exercises, and learned to navigate the intricate political environment of the Senate. Augustus knew that a single misstep by Julius Caesar decades of careful planning. Preparation, subtle guidance, and public acclamation were essential to ensure a smooth transfer of power, one that would preserve the order Augustus had fought so hard to establish. As Augustus aged, he spent more time in contemplation. Villas outside Rome became places of reflection where he reviewed reports, studied histories, and anticipated potential crises. He noted patterns in human behavior, political ambition, and societal tendencies, understanding that the empire's longevity depended on careful foresight. Every decree, every law, every cultural initiative was designed to strengthen institutions, cultivate loyalty, and prepare the empire to survive beyond his lifetime. Augustus' mind became an extension of the empire itself, ensuring stability even in moments of absence. The citizens of Rome, meanwhile, grew accustomed to the peace he maintained. Elections were still held, assemblies still convened, and minor laws debated, but the machinery of governance functioned with the independence from individual whims. Obedience had become routine, loyalty habitual, and order expected. Augustus had accomplished what few men. He had transformed a city once ravaged by civil war into a civilization that not only survived but internalized stability as a virtue. Citizens no longer feared chaos. They took peace for granted, unaware that its existence was the product of decades of deliberate effort. Even as the empire thrived, Augustus understood that longevity required more than administration. It required shaping the mind and spirit of Rome itself. He spent hours observing scholars, philosophers, and historians, studying not just the events of the past, but the patterns of human ambition and societal behavior. He realized that wars had always been won by those who understood people, not just armies, that empires had fallen when citizens forgot the value of order. With this insight, he refined his approach, ensuring that Rome's culture, memory, and civic life were aligned with stability. The arts became an essential tool in his strategy. Poets were encouraged to celebrate Rome's rebirth, highlighting stories of courage, loyalty, and divine favor. Sculptors and painters created works that glorified civic virtues and civic pride. Public monuments commemorated not only victories, lessons learned. Chaos destroyed civilizations. Wisdom preserved them. Augustus himself appeared sparingly in these works, not as a conqueror or tyrant, but as a guiding hand, the protector of Rome's continuity. Citizens absorbed these lessons subtly, internalizing the message that the empire's prosperity was inseparable from the careful stewardship of its ruler. Philosophy and moral instruction were integrated into education across the empire. Young Romans learned that ambition, while tempting, could be dangerous if unchecked. Leadership required disciplined foresight and a deep respect for institutions. Stories of Brutus, Cassius, and even Caesar were told with nuanced morals. Prudence was destructive, loyalty without wisdom was fragile, and only measured guidance ensured survival. Augustus knew that by shaping the next generation's understanding of duty, he was planting the seeds for continued stability long after his death. Meanwhile, the army remained a cornerstone of imperial control. Augustus continued to refine the legions, ensuring that commanders were competent, disciplined, and loyal. Campaigns were carefully orchestrated, not only to defend borders, but to maintain soldiers' confidence in the state rather than individual generals. Soldiers were rewarded with pensions, land, and recognition, binding their personal welfare to the empire's health. Discipline was strict, yet tempered by fairness. Every victory reinforced the principle that honor belonged to Rome, not to any single man. This balance of reward and duty created a professional army that could endure beyond Augustus' personal oversight. Augustus also expanded the system of provincial governance, ensuring that loyalty was rewarded while ambition was constrained. Governors were monitored closely, their correspondence checked, and their actions reported through trusted networks. Laws were implemented uniformly, but with local adaptations to respect custom and traditions. Trade flourished under predictable taxation. Infrastructure projects improved daily life. Roads, aqueducts, and public buildings were citizens of the empire of Rome's presence and efficiency. Augustus understood that prosperity created contentment, and contentment reinforced obedience. Religion continued to serve as a subtle instrument of authority. Festivals, sacrifices, and rituals reinforced hierarchy, obedience, and reverence for civic order. Augustus maintained a careful balance. He did not overtly declare divinity, but associated his reign with divine favor. Temples dedicated to Jupiter, Mars, and otherwise carried inscriptions praising both the gods and the emperor. Citizens were guided to see stability as sacred, obedience as virtuous, and the emperor as the earthly guarantor of divine will. The intertwining of faith and governance created a powerful cultural narrative that would endure for generations. Despite all his outward control, Augustus remained vigilant against internal threats. He monitored political rivalries, personal alliances, and whispered discontent with unwavering attention. Potential threats were neutralized subtly. Reassignment, exile, or social marginalization replaced public execution. Fear persisted, but in a refined form. Citizens understood that stability was valued above all else, and that disruption carried consequences. Augustus had mastered the art of invisible authority. The empire obeyed not out of terror, but out of habit, perception, and internalized understanding. Succession planning became the focus of his later years. Tiberius, carefully trained over decades, assumed greater responsibilities gradually. Augustus observed him in the Senate, in public ceremonies, and in military exercises. The young heir learned to navigate the meticulous, understanding both the rewards of loyalty and the consequences of misjudgment. Augustus tested him, advised him, and prepared him for the moment when he would inherit the empire. The goal was clear: Rome must survive beyond any one man, and the transition of power must be seamless to prevent the return of chaos. As Augustus aged, he became more reflective. He studied Rome's past, noting patterns of ambition, civil war, and societal collapse. He understood that empires rose and fell according to the behavior of citizens as much as generals. Leadership required the careful shaping of perception, expectation, and memory. Through monuments, section, and literature, Augustus had created a civilization that valued order, internalized loyalty, and understood the costs of chaos. The lessons of history had been embedded into the daily lives of ordinary Romans. Peace was no longer fragile, it had become a natural expectation. He also considered the role of legacy. Augustus wanted Rome to endure, not merely his memory. Laws were codified, were cultural institutions strengthened. Citizens learned that their well-being, their security, and their prosperity depended upon Rome's continuity, and by extension, the ruler's careful guidance. Memory became a tool, shaping how history would be perceived, ensuring that future generations would understand the value of order and the perils of ambition. In Augustus' mind, power was inseparable from perception. To govern effectively, one had to govern belief as well as action. Even as he prepared for the inevitable, Augustus remained a presence in everyday life. He attended ceremonies, reviewed military exercises, and oversaw administrative reports. Yet, much of his control operated invisibly. Citizen clicker works, and games, they saw prosperity and stability. A careful orchestration that made it possible remained largely unseen. Augustus' genius was subtlety. Control exercised openly provoked resistance. Control exercised through institutions, culture, and perception inspired consent. Rome obeyed because it had learned that stability was both natural and necessary. The provinces mirrored this order. Governors administered cities with efficiency, trade flourished, and borders were secure. Citizens grew accustomed to the benefits of Roman oversight, safety, prosperity, and civic participation in approved forms. Military campaigns were conducted with minimal disruption to daily life, ensuring loyalty through predictability rather than fear. Augustus' influence permeated every corner of the empire, from distant colonies to the heart of Rome itself. Citizens realized the full extent of his control. They only experienced the results: peace, order, and prosperity. Even death, when it approached, could not disturb the structures he had built. Augustus ensured that Tiberius' succession would be smooth, ceremonial, and accepted. The young heir assumed authority not as a conqueror, but as a steward of the empire. Augustus' decades of careful planning, subtle guidance, and cultural shaping ensured that the empire would endure beyond his lifetime. Rome had learned to function efficiently, obediently, and loyally independent of its founder, yet shaped by his wisdom. Even as Augustus approached the later years of his life, his mind remained restless, turning constantly over the empire he had forged. He understood that no empire survived on administration alone. The hearts and minds of citizens, soldiers, and allies needed careful shaping. He observed the rhythms of Rome, its markets, its forms, its temples, and noted how public perception influenced obedience. Every procession, every speech, every festival was an opportunity to reinforce the narrative of continuity, stability, and divine favor. Augustus had learned from the failures of ambition, personal rivalry, and fragmented authority were deadly. His goal was not merely to rule Rome, but to reshape it, embedding lessons of history into its very foundations. He spent hours in private reflection, reviewing the reports of governors, commanders, and senators. Each province was examined meticulously. Are the roads maintained? Are taxes collected fairly? Are the citizens content or restless? Even the citizens' content ripple into unrest if unchecked. Augustus understood that vigilance was eternal. Power required constant attention, even when appearances suggested calm. In correspondence, he praised loyalty and competence, while subtly discouraging excess ambition. A gentle warning could be more effective than a harsh punishment. For fear that was invisible but persistent, shaping behavior without provoking rebellion. The arts continued to flourish under his guidance. Architects, sculptors, and painters celebrated the achievements of Rome, producing works that highlighted unity, discipline, and civic virtue. Monuments, statues, and arches adorned the city, each bearing in citizens of the cost of chaos and the wisdom of steady guidance. Public spaces were carefully arranged to communicate order and permanence. Even civic buildings were designed to impress, projecting both the practical functionality of governance and the grandeur of imperial authority. Through these subtle yet pervasive cultural signals, Augustus ensured that Rome's citizens internalized history and the importance of stability. The army remained both a tool of protection and a means of reinforcing legitimacy. Augustus ensured that legions were disciplined, loyal, and rewarded fairly. Veterans received pensions, land, and honorific recognition, while generals were constrained by rotation, oversight, and accountability. Soldiers understood that their service contributed not only to immediate victories, but to the long-term stability of Rome. Campaigns were carefully planned, with minimal disruption to civilian life, and victories were celebrated as achievements of the state rather than of individual commanders. This approach minimized the risk of military ambition undermining political stability, a problem that had plagued Rome for decades. Even in religious matters, Augustus' strategy was subtle. Temples, rituals, and festivals emphasized divine favor toward Rome, linking prosperity and stability to obedience and loyalty. Augustus was careful not to overtly declare himself a god, but he cultivated an aura of sacred authority. Citizens associated the empire's order with divine will, reinforcing the legitimacy of imperial power. Festivals celebrated the gods, the city, and the emperor simultaneously, weaving civic pride, religious devotion, and loyalty into a single narrative. By embedding authority into cultural and spiritual life, Augustus created an empire that obeyed voluntarily, guided by belief as much as law. As the years passed, Augustus' thoughts turned increasingly to the continuity of leadership. Tiberius, trained carefully over decades, assumed responsibilities gradually. The young heir observed Senate proceedings, presided over minor ceremonies, and led limited military exercises under Augustus' supervision. This slow induction ensured that Tiberius understood both the rewards and responsibilities of power. Augustus' final lesson was clear. The empire must survive beyond any one man, and its institutions must function without interruption. A smooth transition was essential to prevent civil strife or the collapse of trust in leadership. In the city, citizens continued to engage in daily life largely unaware of the careful orchestration behind their stability. Markets flourished, festivals entertained, and civic duties were performed. Public perception of freedom remained intact even as real power resided with Augustus. Obedience had become a habit, loyalty a natural expectation. The machinery of governance operated efficiently, responding to challenges before they became crises. Augustus had succeeded in creating a system where peace, order, and prosperity were assumed by all, yet owed to none other than his careful guidance. Beyond Rome, the empire reflected the same careful balance of power and influence. Governors administered regions with precision. Military outposts secured borders, and infrastructure created tangible benefits for local populations. Trade routes were maintained, cultural exchange expanded, and cities prospered under predictable administration. Augustus' reach extended invisibly across continents, yet its effects were felt tangibly. Citizens and soldiers alike enjoyed the benefits of stability without witnessing the intricate planning that enabled it. The empire had internalized order, a remarkable achievement of political, social, and cultural engineering. As death approached, Augustus' final reflections were philosophical. He understood that empires were fragile, that the lessons of history must be embedded deeply, and that power required wisdom, patience, and subtlety. He had built institutions that transcended presence, cultivated loyalty through culture and education, and aligned civic and military interests with the state. Augustus realized that the true measure of leadership was not conquest, wealth, or personal glory, but the ability to shape a civilization that could endure beyond one lifetime. Tiberius, ready to assume authority, represented the culmination of this effort. The transition was ceremonial yet seamless, with the Senate, military, and citizenry recognizing continuity rather than rupture. Augustus' decades of careful preparation, strategic insight, and subtle influence ensured that Rome would survive intact. The empire now possessed a stable bureaucracy, disciplined military, cultural cohesion, and a populace that understood both the value and the cost of order. Augustus had achieved what few men in history could: the creation of a civilization capable of sustaining itself. In his final days, Augustus walked through the city, observing the monuments, the forums, and the bustling streets. He saw citizens engaged in daily life, soldiers performing drills, and priests overseeing rituals. Everything was in its place, functioning according to the principles he had established. Even the memory of civil war seemed distant, absorbed into lessons and legends that guided behavior without inspiring fear. Augustus felt the weight of his legacy and the satisfaction of a life dedicated to the survival and flourishing of Rome. As he prepared for his final departure, Augustus' thoughts turned outward, beyond Rome, beyond time itself. He understood that history would remember his achievements not merely as the accumulation of power, but as the cultivation of order, loyalty, and civilization. The empire was no longer fragile. It had been transformed into a living testament to careful planning, moral guidance, and strategic foresight. The shadow of his hand would linger over Rome for generations, shaping the destiny of an empire that would endure long after his voice fell silent. Even in the final months of his life, Augustus remained vigilant, observing the empire he had forged with tireless care. Rome was calm on the surface, yet he knew that peace required constant stewardship. He moved carefully among the Senate, attending debates with quiet authority, offering advice and corrections only when necessary. Senators respected him, not merely out of fear, but because Augustus had become the embodiment of itself. His presence alone reminded Rome that chaos had been conquered and that stability was to be cherished. Tiberius, trained meticulously over decades, was now ready to assume full authority. Augustus watched him closely, observing how he addressed the Senate, inspected the legions, and interacted with citizens. Each decision was scrutinized for wisdom, foresight, and balance. The young heir understood the nuances of governance, when to assert authority, when to yield, and how to cultivate loyalty without provocation. Augustus knew that Tiberius' success would determine whether Rome's hard-won stability endured or unraveled. He guided him gently, reinforcing lessons learned over decades. Power required patience, subtlety, and a deep understanding of human nature. Outside the city, the provinces reflected Augustus' vision. Governors maintained order, soldiers executed duties with discipline, and infrastructure projects ensured prosperity. Trade flowed steadily, cities expanded, and borders remained secure. Even in distant regions, citizens and soldiers internalized the principles Augustus had instilled: loyalty to Rome, recognition of the emperor's guidance, and appreciation for the peace that had been carefully engineered. The empire had become self-sustaining, functioning efficiently even when Augustus was not present. Augustus' final reflections were philosophical. He contemplated the fragility of human institutions, the patterns of history, and the lessons of his own lifetime. He understood that true power was invisible, exercised not through domination or fear, but through shaping perception, culture, and expectation. By embedding stability into the habits, values, and memories of Rome's citizens, he had created an empire capable of enduring beyond a single man's life. He thought of the civil wars that had ravaged chaos he had survived, and the fragile alliances he had managed. In every challenge, he had learned that foresight, subtlety, and discipline were far more potent than brute force. As the day of his departure approached, Augustus walked through Rome one final time. He observed the bustling streets, the citizens performing their daily routines, the temples offering prayers, and the soldiers maintaining order. Monuments as enduring symbols of stability and prosperity. Festivals and games continued to entertain, educate, and reinforce civic cohesion. Augustus saw that Rome had internalized his lessons. Peace was expected, obedience habitual, and loyalty ingrained. The empire was no longer fragile. It had become a living, breathing testament to centuries of careful planning and wisdom. When Augustus passed, it was quietly, with dignity, and surrounded by those who had served him faithfully. The city mourned, yet the mourning was tempered by order and ceremony. Tiberius assumed the mantle of leadership without disruption, presiding over a senate, military, and citizenry prepared to recognize continuity rather than rupture. The transition was seamless, a reflection of decades of preparation, guidance, and subtle influence. Augustus' death marked the end of a life dedicated not to personal glory, but to the preservation, stabilization, and flourishing of Rome. The legacy of Augustus was profound. He had transformed a civilization fractured by ambition and war into a stable, enduring empire. Citizens, soldiers, and officials understood their roles within a system designed to balance power, loyalty, and prosperity. Education, culture, and religion reinforced obedience and civic duty. Infrastructure, law, and military discipline ensured functionality and security. Augustus's genius lay in integrating all these elements into a cohesive whole, invisible yet omnipresent, creating a Rome that could endure for centuries. Even generations later, historians, poets, and philosophers would reflect on the emperor's life, noting that his achievement was not the conquest of territory, nor even the accumulation of power, but the creation of a civilization that understood the value of stability. His subtle influence, exercised through culture, perception, education, and institutions, became a model for rulers who would come long after. He demonstrated that the endurance of an empire relied as much on shaping minds as on wielding armies. Tiberius carried forward Augustus' vision with the guidance already embedded in Roman institutions. The empire continued to function efficiently, provinces remained loyal, trade and culture thrived, and citizens carried on their lives under a familiar structure of order. The machinery of Rome, carefully calibrated by Augustus, responded automatically, maintaining equilibrium even as the original architect passed from the scene. The genius of Augustus lay in this quiescence continued to shape Rome without his direct intervention. The lessons of his reign echoed through time. Civil war had been replaced by a professional army loyal to the state. Political ambition had been balanced by subtle oversight and institutional authority. Culture and religion reinforced cohesion rather than division. Citizens grew up believing in the stability and virtue of Rome, internalizing the values Augustus had cultivated. History remembered him not merely as an emperor, but as a visionary who transformed chaos into enduring civilization. As the sun set over the Forum for the last time under Augustus' watch, the city reflected both his accomplishments and his philosophy. Monuments gleamed in the golden light, streets were orderly, and the hum of daily life continued uninterrupted. Augustus had risen from the ashes of civil war, guided Rome through turmoil, and built an empire that would endure. The city, the citizens, the legions, and even the distant provinces were living proof of his vision. Rome would never forget him. The echoes of his policies, teachings, and subtle influence would resonate for centuries. He had mastered the delicate art of governance, the invisible hand of leadership, and the enduring power of culture, perception, and planning. Augustus had taught the world that true power lies not in domination, but in the creation of systems, beliefs, and institutions that endure beyond one lifetime. The city thrived, the empire endured, and the man who had guided it to greatness faded from view, leaving a legacy that would shape history forever.